Hi, my name is Madeline Hagan. I am a historian with the firm Historical Research Associates in Portland, Oregon. Today I am interviewing Julie Garver on behalf of the Historic Trust for their Officers Row Memories Oral History Project. We are recording in the Marshall House on Officers Row in Vancouver, Washington. Today is November 4th, 2024. Julie, would you please introduce yourself?
My name's Julie Garver, and I am a native of Clark County, born just a few miles from here at Vancouver Memorial Hospital.
Excellent. How did you get involved with Officers Row?
Well, I was attending Clark College and studying accounting, and this was in the mid-'80s. And at that time, Clark College had a jobs board, so us college students, we were always looking for a little something, and I was doing lifeguarding, I think, at the time, and I needed something more. And so there was a posting on the jobs board about an intern that the City of Vancouver was looking for the Officers Row project. And I had good memories of Officers Row from childhood, and so I thought, well, this would be fascinating. And so I went down to City Hall for my interview, and I was sitting there waiting to go into the interview, and a girl walked past me going out with a big smile on her face. All I can remember about her is she had long blonde hair all the way down her back and a big smile, and I thought, oh, that's my competition. I'm not going to make it. And I went in for the interview, and it was with Steve Burdick and Will Mocht. Steve Burdick was the Economic Development Director for the City of Vancouver, and Will Mocht was the development consultant for the project. And I thought the interview went really well. Steve and I especially had a good rapport. Will Mocht asked me the question, do you want to be a developer? And I said, well, I think it's a really interesting career. I'm interested to find out more about it, and I think that would be exciting. And I thought afterward, that probably wasn't the right answer. The right answer probably was, yes, I want to be a developer. But, I was just being honest, and I didn't get the job. And I was sad, and I went back to lifeguarding, which was fun, but not enough. And about 2 months later, Steve Burdick called me and said, the girl we hired didn't make it, didn't last, so can you come and work for us? And so I've been thanking my lucky stars ever since that the girl didn't last, and that they hired me instead.
Yeah. You mentioned childhood memories of the Row. Can you expand on that a little bit?
My mother, Joyce Garver, was an art teacher at Camas High School for many years, and she really liked to expose her students to all different kinds of art experiences. And she felt that architecture was an art experience. And so we would go to downtown Portland and go to the art museum and drive by fantastic buildings and houses on the way. And one of the field trips was to Officers Row. And I can remember she had the field guide for art and architecture, and she would point out the different styles to us that were all embodied in Officers Row. And beyond that, even earlier in childhood, we would take trips to Portland. She also taught music, so we would go to the sheet music store and to the costume store and all of that, and we would always drive down Officers Row, and she would point the houses out to us as we were kids and say what happened there. And so I had fond memories of association from Officers Row.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember thinking about the conditions at all when you were little? What were the conditions like?
Well, it was just a comfortable old shoe at that point, really. It's something that had always been there, and I think the buildings were old, so we all had sort of an expectation that they would be old and that they would just be themselves. I remember being curious about different things that would come and go at the Marshall House. It was the Red Cross for a number of years, and a restaurant that I wanted to go to but never got a chance to, and the Nihonga art exhibit that we did go to as students. Mm-hmm. And so it was a lot of things for a lot of different people, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you got the call that you had gotten the position, what did you anticipate doing in your first few months, or what did the job outline your tasks?
Well, I knew I'd be working with the developer, so Will Mocht, who didn't really like my interview answer, but I was hoping to impress him anyway. It turned out he was a very good debater. And so we would have long debates. I was a 20-year-old kid at the time, and so it was nice that he took the time to debate with me. I'd like, these should be affordable housing, and he's like, these cannot be affordable housing. And I said, these should be affordable housing. And he said, they can't be affordable housing because of the economics of the time. And there was a lot of interesting discussion about what Officers Row should be in its future life at that time. And it had been sort of quasi-affordable housing because the VA had been renting it out to people, and they'd been dealing with leaky pipes and drafty buildings, but interesting, and they were big. And so, but they were cheap, because people had to put up with some stuff. And so one of my jobs was interacting with the tenants that were there, because the developer didn't want to interact with the tenants and the city didn't really want to interact with the tenants. And so I got to be the one that interacted with the residents that were here before the project. And so I was the keeper of the keys, and I would tour the architects around to the building because they had to measure everything ad nauseum because they were splitting up these buildings into residences and offices, and you have to have pretty careful measurements. And so we measured the buildings a lot and repetitively, and I got to know the residents pretty well. And one of the things they liked is that it was so affordable. But Will Mocht explained to me the facts of life at the time, which was this project was going to be really expensive. Initial estimates came in the 5 to 7 million-ish range, and then quickly went up to 10 million, and then even beyond when final bids came in. And he said, there's no way that affordable housing could support the rents that we need to get on Officers Row, because this project will have a mortgage. It'll be a bond mortgage, but it'll be a mortgage like anybody else. And so you got to have money to pay the mortgage. And so it was a really good crash course in economics and how historic buildings have to find their way in our modern world. Of course, I still held out the little hope in the back of my mind that somehow, someday, historic buildings could be affordable housing, a hint toward the future. But at this point, Officers Row had to be a very specific thing. There was a conference center discussed in early plans, and retail and lodging and all kinds of things, but the constraints of the place really dictated what it needed to be in its future. It couldn't accommodate a ton of parking. It couldn't accommodate a ton of extra add-ons, which you kind of need for lodging and retail and all of that kind of stuff. But so it settled its life on, I can remember at the time, the less risky option went to City Council, which was apartments and office space.
Did you feel that Vancouver or Clark County at large was in need of affordable housing at the time?
Well, in 2020 hindsight, it wasn't anything like today because Reaganomics really hadn't hit, and deregulation of a lot of mental institutions and that kind of thing. But I felt strongly about it as a 20-year-old, I think, because I couldn't afford housing. One of the things that the city did, because it was an internship, the pay wasn't a lot. And so they said, well, we have these houses, why don't you live in one? And so our office was number 18, which I can't even remember what the address is now, but this was 15, 16, 17, 18. And so it was the middle house of the three that are the same, east of the Marshall House, and that was our development office. And so in the back of that building was the maids' quarters from days past, And so there was this little tiny stairwell with little pie-shaped stairs that you went up in the very back of the building. And I had a little sitting room and a little bedroom and a little bathroom with a really big clawfoot tub, no shower. So I think that's where I really learned to like baths. But it was a fantastic place to live, and so I got really grounded in that experience. One of the first pieces of furniture that the development team bought for the Marshall House was the very large table that sits in the conference room now, and that was in the dining room of this home that I lived in, and I shared the kitchen space, which was on the main floor. And so my boss said it was okay if I hosted Thanksgiving dinner for my family there one year when I lived there. And so that was a great experience for my family to actually live on Officers Row. And so it was affordable housing for me. And from my relationship with the tenants here before the project, I knew that affordability was important to them. And so obviously Officers Row wasn't that type of place because it needed to pay for some of its own rehab, right, and saving. But it definitely planted that seed in my mind.
Take me through the rehabilitation process. You mentioned architects measuring things. What kind of other components, I guess in the early stages of the rehabilitation, were there?
Well, there was, as the concept changed, from conference and retail and hospitality to apartments and offices, then that really focused the architect's attention on how to split up the homes. Most of them were originally duplexes, but some of them were single homes, and so that determined how many units. And so there's everything from 2 units or 3 units in the house next door to the Marshall House to 8 units in some of the biggest buildings. And I can remember being in job meetings and the architects would talk through, challenges that they were having on the plans because this property was on the National Historic Register, and so the National Park Service says you can do these sets of things and you cannot do these other sets of things. And our attention was very much focused on that and meeting the National Park Service regulations, because that could really delay a project a long time if you had to go back and forth with the National Park Service a lot. And so the architects were struggling with things like, how do you add an extra set of stairs into this space? How do you add kitchens into a space? Because the kitchens have cabinets and things on the upper walls, and how do you work the windows in? And they were really kind of struggling with that. And then they decided that the stairs and the kitchens all got to be on the inboard side, the inboard corners of the units as they were splitting them up. So you have a staircase and it's on the inner wall. And it, even though these Officers Row homes originally didn't have they originally had separate kitchens, right? Not an open plan. The new units really did have kind of the open plan because the kitchen was kind of tucked in the back and then it was open to the living areas. And so it was a very elegant solution for a super challenging little game of Tetris to figure out how, and of course, all the units were different because all the houses were different. And so I think that there might have been 3 houses that actually we had the same plan in, and even those had little differences because when they were built, they had little differences. But it's also one of the things that creates a lot of charm for the houses.
Yeah. And what were some of the challenges in the actual construction process? We're talking about planning and trying to figure out where stairs are going to go and how to deal with the National Park Service. Were there any challenges that you ran into during the construction?
There were a lot of challenges. You always have surprises in historic building projects. And one of the early challenges was that we had to value engineer the budget, which is a super fancy term, which means you got to cut the budget so that you can afford the project. So in its most ideal form, value engineering is the contractor finding hidden ways that you can change the piping of the project and magically save $1 million. Well, we didn't find a lot of those. We found some of those with PNC Construction, who was our contractor on the job. But most of the VE, value engineering, that we found was in things that we kind of had to sacrifice. And so we really wanted hard surface countertops. I think in the late 80s they might have been Korean, or which was originally specified, and we value engineered back to plastic laminate. And we really wanted to restore the hardwood floors, like you have hardwood floors exposed here at the Marshall House in some places. And we had to do carpeting throughout the project. I remember that was a big sacrifice. Everybody was moaning and bemoaning carpeting. It's like, well, the hardwood floors are under there, so if anybody ever wants to find them again, and they have done that at the Grant House, the hardwoods are exposed now. So we tried to select things that weren't like forever choices, but choices that were practical and that could be changed later if somebody changed their minds. We blocked off the fireplaces because we didn't have money to restore the whole chimney thing. The chimneys are still there, of course. Somebody could open them up. But I remember a big deal was made over finding how we were going to finish off the fireplaces. And so it was decided that they were going to have summer fronts. And summer fronts were this panel, usually metal back in the day, that you put in front of the firebox so that you could close it off and you didn't have to look at that. And so I think we ended up making ours out of fiberglass or something. We found a company and that made them all of the summer fronts. And then it was, how are you going to finish the summer fronts? We decided on black because we had some black hardware here and there, and that would be most appropriate. But all of those details that you see in the building now, those were all lengthy discussions in the job meetings to figure out what was going to be the most appropriate and what would strike the right tone and what would be the best finish for the buildings on, the budget that we had and the money saving that we had to do. One of the other challenges that came up during construction was archaeology. Things happened here before Officers Row was here, and the most recent history before just the regular buildings was that there were log cabins in between all of the officers' housing. That was the original housing for people at Officers Row. But so there's these great spaces in between the houses now, but there were buildings there. And between buildings 7 and 8, which are the two little houses right on the traffic circle at Officers Row, we had planned for a parking lot there because those were supposed to be the retail areas. And so I think it was like the first or second scoop of the backhoe, and everybody's like, because there were historians out because we knew that there were things there, and they started to hit things. They were mostly, 1800s era trash that we hit, and I think we hit some old post or brick foundations there. It wasn't super exciting archaeological finds, but still National Park Service said, okay, hey, stop, you have to research this site. And so luckily we had Fort Vancouver nearby, and we had archaeologists hanging out just waiting to come in. And so I think the whole process took maybe 3 months, maybe a little longer, but it was still, whenever anybody in construction hears archaeology, everybody goes, because it does cause a lot of delay. And it really changed the path of Officers Row as well, because that was sort of the one last little retail or engagement holdout. And so it was decided at the time, okay, those are going to turn into office buildings that don't need a ton of parking, so that we can just eliminate that parking lot and have the archaeology just remain under there. And there was some folks that were disappointed at the time that Officers Row wouldn't have that additional active element. We have Marshall House and Grant House, but folks really kind of lamented the loss of that retail. But I do want to mention that we have another opportunity at that sort of vitality and engagement, and that is at the barracks. Because where the officers' row houses were sort of the retreat for the officers after they got off of work. It was for their families, and it was supposed to be an area that was quieter and more relaxing, and that's, what Officers' Row has turned out to be now, today. But the barracks was full of activity and engagement, and soldiers going to the PX and to the NCO club and to all of these great things happening on the barracks, going about their day-to-day lives. And it was a buzzing place of activity. And it could be that way again. Not only the East Barracks, but maybe the West Barracks. Maybe the NPS might like to share that with us. And a boutique hotel could come in there, or an inn, or retail, or restaurants. And imagine the vitality that could be there if a place that was historically designed for activity could be a place of activity again.
That's really interesting. I think when you were originally planning, did you plan for Officers' Row to be that kind of sleepy community, or did you want it to have the vitality?
One of the nice things about life with the City of Vancouver is that they did a lot of community engagement. And I think that there was a sense of Officers' Row wanting to be all things to all people. And it would have been great, right? It would have been great for hospitality to be here, for restaurants to be here. And we do have a restaurant now, which is cool. And we do have a lot of public access at the Marshall House and the Grant House, which was a nice compromise, considering. But with the National Register status and with what Officers' Row was originally designed to be, it really wanted to end up that way. I'll ask you to indulge me for a few minutes and pretend that it's 1899 and that you are a young officer's wife. You're back east, you just got married. He's handsome. And you're excited about his future as an officer in the Army. But he just broke the news to you. You have to go out west. It's wild out west. I mean, aren't they still fighting wars out there? It's 1899. How could we go out west? How will I keep my skirts clean? They say that Vancouver, all the streets aren't even paved. And I hear a rumor that there might be more bars than churches in Vancouver. I'm really not sure about this place. Well, it's the day we arrived. We're on our carriage ride from the train station to Officers' Row. There are some cobblestones, which I'm happy to see. But we're approaching the west gates of Vancouver Barracks, and I can see the stone pillars up ahead, but oh my goodness, there's a wall of fir trees. It really is the Wild West. It's a forest. How are we going to live here? Well, we're approaching the gatehouse now, so there's a soldier at the gatehouse, so at least somebody's kind of watching over things. I'm relieved to see, but I just am lonely from my life back east. I wish we could be in a more civilized place. Well, the carriage is starting again, and I can see the commanding officer's house over to the right, General Howard. He was a good guy, and his wife lived here, so maybe that's a good sign. And now the parade grounds are opening up on the right. That feels more familiar. I'm more used to open spaces and parade grounds. As we're traveling down the main road that goes through the barracks, off to the left, I think I can see the houses. I think I can see the officers' houses, and they look like home. They look more like what I'm used to back east. They're big, and they have big porches, and they have some gracious gingerbread detailing. It's that new style, Victorian. I'm excited. This might have some promise. We're continuing down the street, and there's actually streetlights. There's streetlights on this road. The road isn't paved, I might add, but it has streetlights, and it's well kept. We're stopping. I think that's our house. It even has a turret. And the coachman opens the door, and there are steps. There's steps for us to get out of the carriage right there on the road. And as we step down, there's a boardwalk sidewalk. I don't have to worry about my skirts getting dirty after all. We're walking up to the front door of the house now, and there's a gracious porch. It really does feel like some of the buildings back east. We go up the stairs and we reach for the black porcelain doorknob on the big doors, and I think, this place really could be home. So as I told that story, what are some of the first thoughts or feelings that came into your mind?
Relief, I guess.
Relief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it can be home for someone.
So I think you hit the nail on the head of what everybody felt like this place needed to be. You know, its National Register designation already being on the register. It was the officers' homes. We wanted to impart that feeling of history, that feeling of welcoming, that feeling of respite. And when you ask people why historic preservation is important, I mean, history geeks like us, we always love the buildings, right? The buildings. But it's not really about the buildings, it's about the people. Not only the people that lived here originally, maybe worrying about their skirts or their kids out here in the wild, wild west and what it was going to be like, but the people now, the people in the community, the people that get to walk up the walks and hold on to the porcelain doorknobs and see what things were like and have that feeling of generational impact in the community. That's what preservation's all about to us. And ultimately, through all of the budget challenges and debates about what this area wanted to be, we really had to go back to that. What was that original feeling, and how can that shine through?
Yeah. You mentioned community outreach and community involvement. Can you talk about some of the public programming you were involved with?
Well, lucky for me, the city hired me after that first internship on Officers Row, and I really got a wonderful education from all of the people that I got to work with here on Officers Row, not only Steve Burdick and Will Mocht, but the architects, George McMath and Will Hawkins and Rob Dortnack, and the contractors. There was a great contractor, a superintendent on the job. His name was Frank Messenger. Their offices were right out here outside the Marshall House. They had a job trailer, and so I remember going to the job trailer a lot and checking in with them about key management or things that we said we were going to do in last month's job meeting and how those were wrapping up and what did they find, what surprises did they find on the job that week. And he really taught me a lot about perseverance, and no matter what comes up in these old buildings, you've got to find a way to deal with them. And so that was really fun to get to know him. And ironically, the superintendent on the Howard House job, his name was also Frank. His name was Frank Temple. And I found him to be the same sort of character. A little gruff around the edges, but heart of gold, and a lot of knowledge and experience on the job and dealing with these old buildings. Yes, code is important. Yes, you have to meet code. But you also have to make it work within the framework of the building that is here. And so one of the things that I enjoyed after the city hired me to manage the Marshall House was different ways of figuring out how to get people involved with history and this place. So we had things that were focused on fun, like wreath making parties at the holidays. I had a friend who had access to a lot of greenery. And so he would, his name was Don Blount, and he would bring the greenery to the Marshall House, and we even had a tent set up. We did the first one in the back room, and that turned out to be chaos. And so the next year, we rented a tent and had heaters and had the greens delivered, and for a couple of seasons there, we made wreaths on Officers Row. We also had a Victorian Santa who would be right here in the parlor and read stories to kids. He had Helen's Pacific Costumers, flashback from my childhood, had this great these great robes, and they were velvet robes with white fur, and he had a hat that went with it, and he had this deep, resonant voice. Robert Byheller, he and Michael Williams did our original Officers Row slideshow, which had a lot of great historic photos and photos of construction, and he had this rich, resonant voice and super nice beard, and he just made a great Santa. And so we had a lot of fun programs like that. And then we had programs that edged more on the educational. We had exhibits here. We had a great one about C.E.S. Wood and Chief Joseph, that we borrowed a lot of Native American artifacts and also military artifacts and had it right here in the Marshall House, and also did a great slideshow video for. And then we had some events that kind of really mixed up the two, which were probably my favorites, which is you have history, but you inject a lot of fun into it. And we had a program called Ghost Stories on Officers Row. And so some of them were actually ghost stories of people that had seen spirits in different buildings. And then some of them were stories that we told about the history, about General Sully dying in the Grant House. And we had some history that interpreted Amelia Earhart and her flight. We actually brought a plane up from Pearson Air Park, parked it in the parking lot of the Marshall House, and my mother played the part of Amelia Earhart in these skits that we did for Ghost Stories on Officers Row. And so it was a really fun way of getting people to know a little bit of the history, getting them over to the row, and having a lot of fun while we were doing it.
Yeah. You mentioned surprises on a weekly basis. Are there any notable surprises that you remember?
Well, the archaeology was a big one. There was a hot and heavy debate about plaster. You really didn't know that people could talk as much about plaster as we did on Officers Row. There were some purists in the group that said, we have to have plaster, it's going back in the row. And then there was those of us on the budget side that said, we cannot afford plaster on Officers Row. You can see here in the ceiling of the Marshall House, there was some pretty fantastic plaster. In the other Officers Row houses, it was a little more simple, but there were still some nice plaster details. And so we kept as much of the plaster as we physically could. We had electricians that were opening little holes in the bottom and the top, trying to fish wire through the walls and the ceilings, and they would come to us at job meetings and say, we really can't do that. And we said, you have to do that. And so they went ahead and did it. And so most of the time we were able to save the plaster. But there was one day, I can remember, it was a big crisis at the job meeting. The contractors came in all dejected, and they sat down and they said, well, we have bad news for you. The keys broke in house number 17. And we're like, keys? What keys? The keys in plaster, you have lath and plaster, so when you squish the plaster through the keys, it squishes through and holds through the lath. And so those pieces on the back, they're called keys. And so through vibration or whatever happened with house 17, a whole big wall of plaster crashed down on top of the stairwell one day. And everybody was just like, oh my God, I can't believe it. But, and so then there was the discussion of, do we go back with plaster? Do we go back with drywall? Do we go back with plaster? So it finally was decided that we would put drywall on, in the same thickness as the old plaster, because it was a big wall and it didn't have any super big details on it. But that was one of the creativity of the project team, is to figure out when is it important to use the plaster specialty expensive treatment, and when is it appropriate to use the more regular treatments. And so when you had the plaster detail, you brought the plaster guy in. But if you have a big wall where your keys break off, then you use your drywall.
Mm-hmm. You've already mentioned it just a little tad, but can you tell me how your career developed after you left Officers Row?
Well, I think that a big part of my career not only got prepped by all the great mentors I had during the Officers Row project when I was an intern, but also by the Howard House project. I'd been with the city for about a decade, and they were looking for a project manager for the Howard House project. I'd had a little taste of project management in the early 90s when we restored the porch on the Marshall House. When we did the Officers Row project, as I mentioned, we were looking for ways to save money. And somebody in the past had remodeled the porch on the Marshall House to have simpler elements, a lot less gingerbread. And it was in pretty good shape. And so we decided as a cost-saving measure to save it during the Officers Row project. The house also had a fairly decent roof. It was red, but it was decent. And so we kept it. Everybody was like, oh, I can't believe we're keeping that red roof. But we needed to shave some dollars, and we did. But a fantastic finance guy at the City of Vancouver named Kent Shorthill, a few years later, figured out a way to refinance the Officers Row bonds. And that gave us some extra money to play with during a time in the project when you usually don't have a lot of money. And that gave us the chance to restore the exterior of the Marshall House. And so I worked with an architect named Dan Edwards. He had worked with McMath, Hawkins, Dortnacht during the original project, and I'd gotten to know him. And he meticulously drew plans from the historic photographs, because we didn't have any plans for the Marshall House. And that we had a couple of really good views. And so I got to manage that project. PNC did it for us again, and that was great. But it was little, it was a couple $100,000 at that time. And so I didn't really have a lot of experience to be the project manager at the Howard House. But the city manager at the time, John Fischbach, he was a great believer in community interaction and interaction of neighborhoods and people, and that people could basically build the village. And I happened to live in Houck neighborhood at the time, which is a neighborhood in downtown Vancouver, and I was the chair of the neighborhood association. We were going through a little controversy at the time in our neighborhood. Some development was happening, and so we, the neighborhood association, had to work with the developer to get some live-work units in where they just kind of wanted to have work units and get a park in. And so we were doing this negotiating, and it was in the paper, and there was a little bit of controversy. And so the city manager called me into the office one day and he said, so you're having a little challenges there with the neighborhood association. I'm like, well, it's just part of the process. You just have to work through it until you can meet the spirit of what the neighborhood wants. And we were able to work through it, and we worked with the Vancouver Housing Authority and got a park and got some live-work units and really got some great things for the neighborhood. And I said to the city manager, and can you let me do the Howard House project? And he said, yes. So that was a great success for me. And I had great folks to work with. David DeCesare was my boss at the City of Vancouver at that time, and he was a great boss, and I could always go into his office and bend his ears on stuff. And the Parks Department was there. I remember going to the Parks Department and saying, hey, we need to figure out what's going to happen around the Howard House. This is a great big piece of property, and the landscape architect would really like it to be meandering, natural, Japanese, Oriental style, which sounds really fun. However, I really think we need a plaza because people will want to gather. And so the Parks Department said, yes, do a plaza. Yes, have people gather. And oh, by the way, here's the Fort Vancouver Rose Society, and they want to do some historic big garden roses out in the yard. They have a really nice rose garden in Esther Short Park, but it's tea roses, they're little. And so with the Howard House, we had this chance to do these, big gardens worth of roses, and they're still there, which is exciting. And we asked for public input on other things. We had a group of caterers that worked here at the Marshall House for event rentals when we were doing event rentals here. And so I asked one of them who was interested, Susan Courtney, to say, okay, well, for a catering kitchen at the Howard House. What would you like to be different about it, the Marshall House? So she came in and she helped us design the catering kitchen, and then we asked the people doing events and the folks that had offices here, well, what do you wish you had more of? And the answer was, we wish we had more outlets, and we wish we had networking for, so we can plug our computers in. And even though the Howard House was planned to be a welcome center, an event center for exhibits, there was going to be professional exhibits there, and that's why the colors on the inside of the house are more muted, because it was designed for a more traditional exhibit. But it turned out financially that it ended up being more feasible to do offices at the Howard House and that kind of thing. And so those extra outlets and the data jacks came in really handy. Another lesson learned from Officers Row is that it really is nice if you have more things that were accessible and more ways of them being accessible. And so at the Howard House, we worked the grades so that the back part of the house had some really nice entryways and access to parking and ADA grades, and we added an elevator at the Howard House. And so that worked out great for accessibility. One lesson learned that we could not employ at the Howard House was the plaster thing again. Oh my gosh, so tired of talking about plaster. But the Howard House had a fire, and it had a lot of water damage. I mean, it was rough. There was a point where we tore those flat-roofed NCO wings off of the Howard House that you could see clear through the building. And the contractor said, we need to get some shoring up right away because it's starting to go like this in the wind. And so they came in and they shored it. But we had to take the lath and plaster off just because it was falling off. There were no keys. It was done and done. But the problem is that when you take all that stuff off, you see how it was framed in 1879, which is not code today. And so the structural engineer really struggled with that house, and we struggled with budget, because of course you don't know any of that until you get in there and you have to take the plaster off. And in the back part of the house, we really wanted to keep the siding. And so we left the siding, exterior siding on, but none of the windows had headers. You typically have this big piece over the window that carries the load from above. None of them had it. And there hadn't been any significant sagging. We were like, hey, can't we just leave them like that? And he's like, no. You have to cut in these big, expensive headers, and that's really hard to save the siding on the outside. And we were like, ugh. We couldn't really figure it out. We had a great contractor for the Howard House named Robertson Hay and Ian Robertson. But he was really frustrated with the structural engineer too, and I really needed to get input from somebody outside the project who was sort of a neutral observer. So on a Saturday, one of the guys from PNC, Rich Tolfstead, came over, and he, as a favor, looked at this area with me, and I said, we're in a conundrum. I can't afford to do these headers. We want to keep the siding. We don't know how to do this. And he said, well, you need metal gusset panels. And I said, what's a metal gusset panel? He says, it's a square piece of metal that you cut out and you put it above the window, and then you put a bunch of screws all over, and that transfers the load. So I couldn't wait until the job meeting the next week, where I got to go in and I got to wave my arms to the structural engineer and say, I think we should use metal gusset panels in these areas. And they're like, oh yeah, that'll work. So that was a great success. And in my career later on, in actually a new construction project, we had the same sort of issue. The structural engineers were going on and on about how it was new framing, but somebody just didn't frame it the right way, and we couldn't deal with it. And I said, how about we use a gusset panel above those windows? And they're like, oh yeah, how did you know about that? And I said, well, when you work on old buildings, you try to figure out a way to make it work. So coming out of the Officers Row project and the Howard House project, I really wanted to work construction, and I decided to go back to school. I had accounting experience at Clark College 2-year, and I really wanted to go back and get a degree. And so I went back to Portland State, and I'd originally intended to do architecture there, architectural project management, took a lot of those classes, but at Portland State, they do this thing where they encourage you to take different electives, and then they bring people from the community in to talk with you. And so it was a housing class, urban history of urban housing or something in the U.S., and they brought in an affordable housing developer, and it was a woman. And she talked about how hard it was to do affordable housing, how many funding sources you had to have, how long it took, how difficult construction was, and then she talked about the need and how many people in the U.S. were paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And the number was pretty staggering. And that's when I decided that that's really what I wanted to do. And so I interviewed with a company called Innovative Housing. And it was a friend of a friend who knew that they were looking. And it was a one-person shop at that time. The executive director had kind of rebuilt the agency from that it had some challenges during the September 11th timeframe. Trying to sell affordable condos at September 11th was challenging, evidently. But they'd been rebuilding the organization and they needed a developer. And so I went in and interviewed with them, and a lot of the discussion, of course, was my history at Officers Row and management of the Howard House project. And we got into a lot of the things about how you manage a project and how you deal with surprises in old buildings that came up. Well, turns out that one of their first projects that they needed to do was an old building. It was the Foster Hotel in Old Town Portland, where Darcel's is at. And so they were interested in my experience, especially because of old buildings. And since then, I think we've done 6 historic building projects. And the most recent building is on the National Register. It's called the Anna Mann House. It was built in 1910 as an old folks home. And kind of a neat story, Charles and Anna Mann were the instigators of the project, and they purchased the land in Laurelhurst and got the plans ready. And just before they were ready to start construction, he dies. And so Anna Mann ran the whole construction project and operated the old folks home for 10 years after it opened. So a great history of women developers there. But it's been a great run at Innovative Housing. I've been there for 20 years, and I really enjoyed the historic renovation projects we've done. We did one in Astoria called the Merwin Apartments, Merwin Hotel, and it was a great old hotel building right next door to City Hall. And we're hoping to do another historic building in Astoria called the Copeland. So it was a great preparation. And it really had a lot of transferability to new construction as well. Because as anybody in the business can tell you, there are surprises in new construction as well as old buildings. And so if you can do an old building, then those skills will transfer well to a new building.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the importance of old buildings in our housing stock are? What are the opportunities there?
I was just recently on a panel in Portland for Sustainability Week on office to res conversion in downtown Portland. There's a lot of office space in downtown Portland, and now with US Bank and Wells Fargo both moving out, we just opened up a lot of square footage. And it's at a time where downtown Portland is just starting to revive. Innovative Housing, our offices moved to downtown Portland. We got a heck of a deal, as you might imagine, since there's a lot of office space vacant. And some buildings are going to translate well to office to res conversion because they're not as deep and their floor plates work better. Some of them are not. The US Bank Core Tower probably isn't going to be residential anytime soon. But there are a lot of buildings in Portland that would work well for office to res conversion, and Vancouver as well. And of course, historic buildings are especially nice because you don't have any PT slabs in historic buildings, post-tension slabs, where you have all of this complex tensioning wires going through the slabs and then trying to put all of your drains through there. That's pretty time-consuming and expensive. It's not going to save a lot of money in converting old buildings to residential, but you are saving a lot of embodied energy, because tearing all those buildings down and then replacing them with all the new materials, that's a lot of materials. It's a lot of materials in the waste stream, and it's a lot of energy already expended that you don't need to expend again. And so that's why we were talking about it during Sustainability Week, is the sustainability and just the character of the city being able to, again, for people maintaining those history points, those points of reference, those points that have been important to us in our childhoods and histories. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for office to res conversion. Certainly for my career, we've done a lot of different buildings. Most of them were hotels in their past. One was a saloon, the Erickson Fritz. That was a saloon. It featured the longest bar west of the Mississippi, 284 feet of bars. So a fun place. But it's a really neat project. We created a big atrium in the center to get light and air into those inboard units. And we worked with a local community artist to interpret some of the history. And we had an actual piece of the bar from the Erickson that we saved and made into an art piece, and a whiskey barrel and clouds, and the artist's interpretation in this. It was a 30 by 40 foot atrium, so it was big. And when we just finished the project, I was in the atrium doing something project management related, and a resident was standing by her door, and she was just standing there looking at all of the art in the atrium, and I paused, and I didn't want to interrupt her, and finally she noticed me, and she said, "Oh, you caught me. I was just enjoying this place." She said, "I have to tell you that this is the most beautiful place I've ever lived." And so I think that that's the biggest case, really, to be made for utilizing historic buildings and adaptively reusing them for something new, is that people get to enjoy them, and they get to have a different experience that you would in a new construction apartment. New construction is great, love it, but it doesn't have that feeling of the past, that feeling of nostalgia, that emotion that old buildings evoke in a lot of people. We just finished our Anna Mann project, and we had the grand opening in late summer while it was still nice outside. And so we had the opening speeches outdoors in a courtyard, and the building was open, so there were people living there. And it was the first grand opening that I'd ever been at that you could not hear the speeches because the children playing in the yard in the background were too loud. And it was like, yeah, that's the way it should be.
That's really sweet. Are there any questions that you wish that I had asked you during our interview?
Let me check my notes.
So I think that you answered everything so well, and
I think the one thing that I would like to go back to is the people, the Royce Pollards, the Bruce Higginsons, the Pat Gelatas, the folks that really made Officers Row happen. I was a very small cog in the wheel when I was here, and it took a lot of political will to do this, and it took a lot of people bringing their expertise on so many different fronts. Paul Nelson and Key Property Services were our property managers, and when I was an intern, my office was right next to his. And so I got to listen to his property management side of the equation, which is a lot different than construction. And so you bring these interdisciplinary efforts into making this place, which was so important because you're able to not only support the property financially, but you're able to make it great for the people and the community.
Yeah.
And that's what really made Officers Row happen, is all of the amazing people that were willing to stand up and say, this place matters, and it's all of our responsibility to bring it to completion and make it shine.
Julie, thank you so much.
Thank you.